Hi, this is Mike Bevel, and this is Footnotes. Two different things. I'm Mike Bevel. The whole thing is Footnotes. We're reading Middlemarch by my good friend George Eliot, um, who's been dead a while, so our friendship is. I'm kind of stretching the term friendship at this point since we haven't really ever met. But I feel like we would like each other. Anyway, we're up to chapter 6. And it opens. I'm going to try not to. Yeah, this is as good as it's going to get, guys. I'm sorry. Let's bring the microphone. Oh, can I show you? Can I show you something non-Middlemarch related? Look at this beautiful teapot I bought myself because I'm bad with money. And from it, I'm drinking some delicious English breakfast. All right. We open chapter 6 with a piece of writing from George Eliot. It's, again, the sort of the, what's the word I'm looking for? There's a word for it, and it's in that brain of mine, and it's not on that tongue of mine, so I can't remember. Like epigraph, is that it? Epigraph, epigram, telefran, telephone, telegraph. Do people know what telegraphs are? They do, but not, I think not everyone. I think that's one of those things that's slowly going away. My lady's tongue is like the meadow blades that cut you stroking them with idle hand. Nice cutting is her function. She divides with spiritual edge the millet seed and makes intangible savings. The fuck does that mean? Don't know. My lady's tongue is like the meadow blades that cut you stroking them with idle hands. And maybe it's sort of, well, that part sort of makes sense, doesn't it? Like, if you are not, my lady's tongue is like the meadow blades that cut you stroking them. If you're not intentional, then you're going to get hurt. If you grasp stinging nettles, sort of not brush against them, but grab them, they don't sting, is a thing I remember from childhood. It may not be true. I once made Zachary touch some stinging nettles in Ireland, I think. And I felt guilty about it ever since because I knew what was going to happen. I'm just a jerk. My lady's tongue is like the meadow blades that cut you stroking them with idle hands. Nice cutting is her function. She divides with spiritual edge the millet seed and makes intangible savings. So it sort of sounds like we're describing someone, and I wonder if we are describing Mrs. Cadwallader, who I think we meet in this chapter. As Mr. Casaubon's carriage was passing out of the gateway, it arrested the entrance of a pony phaeton. So a phaeton is a kind of carriage, in case you weren't aware, driven by a lady with the servant seated behind. It was doubtful whether the recognition had been mutual, for Mr. Casaubon was looking absently before him, but the lady was quick-eyed and threw a nod and a "how do you do" in the nick of time. In spite of her shabby bonnet and very old Indian shawl, it was plain that the lodge-keeper regarded her as an important personage from the low curtsy which was dropped on the entrance of the small phaeton. So, I've said a couple of times that I'm not going to do voices because I'm not an actor. I don't do accents. I don't, not a lot of skills. And we're coming up on some dialogue that is written because the person has an accent. I'm still not going to do it, but it might. I mean, if it happens, we're just gonna, the polite thing is just not to notice, right? And then you can make fun of me behind my back, the way Baptists have been trained to do, and that's called manners. Well, Mrs. Fitchett, how are your fowls laying now? Said the high-colored, dark-eyed lady with the clearest chiseled utterance. Pretty well for laying, madam, but they've taken to eating their eggs. I've no peace of mind with them at all. Oh, the cannibals. Better sell them cheap at once. What will you sell them a couple? One can't eat fowls of a bad character at a high price. Well, madam, 1/2 crown. I couldn't let him go not under. 1/2 crown these times. Come now, for the rector's chicken broth on a Sunday. He has consumed all hours that I can spare. You are half paid with the sermon, Mrs. Fitchett, remember that. Take a pair of tumbler pigeons for them, little beauties. You must come and see them. You have no tumblers among your pigeons. Well, madam, Master Fitchett shall go and see him after work. He's very hot on new sorts. To oblige you. Oblige me? It'll be the best bargain he ever made. A pair of church pigeons for a couple of wicked Spanish fowls that eat their own eggs. Don't you and Fitchett boast too much, that is all. The phaeton was driven onwards with the last words leaving. Oh, sorry, let's try that again. The phaeton was driven onwards with the last words, leaving Mrs. Fitchett laughing and shaking her head slowly with an interjectional surely, surely, for which it might be inferred that she would have found the countryside somewhat duller if the rector's lady had been less free-spoken and less of a skinflint. Indeed, the farmers and labourers in the parishes of Freshitt and Tipton would have felt a sad lack of conversation but for the stories about what Mrs. Cadwallader said and did. A lady of immeasurably high birth, descended, as it were, from unknown earls, dim as the crowd of heroic shades, who pleaded poverty, pared down prices, and cut jokes in the most companionable manner, though with a turn of tongue that let you know who she was. Such a lady gave a neighborliness to both rank and religion and mitigated the bitterness of uncommuted tithe. A much more exemplary character with an infusion of sour dignity. Good morning, it's Sunday. Not doing so hot with the talkity-talkity. A much more exemplary character with an infusion of sour dignity would not have furthered their comprehension of the 39 articles and would have been less socially uniting. Those 39 articles are the articles of the Church of England, sort of what makes the church the church. Why they're Anglican and not Catholic at this point. And we know that they're not Catholic because of Henry. And I will go off about Henry VIII at the drop of a hat, but we're not reading about Henry VIII. We're reading about Middlemarch. So I'm going to hold on to that whole thing. Let's see. Let's take another sip of tea. Mr. Brooke, seeing Mrs. Cadwallader's merits from a different point of view, winced a little when her name was announced in the library where he was sitting alone. I see you have had our Loic Cicero here, she said, seating herself comfortably, throwing back her wraps and showing a thin but well-bit figure. I suspect you and he are brewing some bad politics, else you would not be seeing so much of the lively man. I shall inform against you. Remember, you are both suspicious characters since you took Peel's side about the Catholic bill. I shall tell everyone that you are going to put up Middlemarch on the Whig side when old Pinkerton resigns, and that Casaubon is going to help you in an underhand manner, going to bribe the voters with pamphlets and throw open the public houses to distribute them. Come, confess. Nothing of the sort, said Mr. Brooke, smiling and rubbing his eyeglasses, but really blushing a little at the impeachment. Casaubon and I don't talk politics much. He doesn't care much about the philanthropic side of things, punishments and that kind of thing. He only cares about church questions. That is not my line of action, you know. Rather too much, my friend. I have heard of your doings. Who was it that sold his bit of land to the papists at Middlemarch? I believe you bought it on purpose. You are a perfect Guy Fawkes. Guy Fawkes. I haven't seen it spelled that way. You got it, Guy Faux. Anyway, see if you were not burnt in effigy this 5th of November coming. Humphrey would not come to quarrel with you about it, so I am come. Very good. I was prepared to be persecuted for not persecuting. Not persecuting, you know. There you go. This is a piece of claptrap you have got ready for the hustings. Now, do not let them lure you into the hustings, my dear Mr. Brooke. A man always makes a fool of himself speechifying. There's no excuse but being on the right side so that you can ask blessing on your humming and hawing. You will lose yourself. You will make a Saturday pie of all parties' opinions and be pelted by everyone. That is what I expect, you know, said Mr. Brooke, not wishing to betray how little he enjoyed this prophetic sketch. What I expect as an independent man. As to the Whigs, a man who goes with the thinkers is not likely to be hooked on by any party. He may go with them up to a certain point, you know. But that is what you ladies never understand. You know what? Let's take a moment here, because I don't know it well enough off the top of my head just to speak extemporaneously. But I think maybe we do need to know a little bit about who the Whigs and the Tories are, if you don't know. So we will go to our good friend Wikipedia. Let's type in Whig. Whigs, British political party. And Whig is W-H-I-G, not like the B-52s. The Whigs were a political faction and then a political party in the parliaments of England, Scotland, Great Britain, Ireland, and the United Kingdom. Between the 1680s and the 1850s, the Whig contested power with their rivals, the Tories. The Whigs' origin lay in constitutional monarchism in opposition to absolute monarchy, supporting a parliamentary system. The Whigs played a central role in the Glorious Revolution of 1688. That's where Charles I got it off. And were the standing enemies of the Stuart kings and pretenders who were Roman Catholic. Okay, so Whigs are anti-Catholic. And what we know about Mr. Brooke is he has a reputation as being pro-Catholic. Interesting. While the Whig and Tory parties began as loose groupings or tendencies, both became quite formal by 1784 with the ascension of Charles James Fox as the leader of a reconstituted Whig party. Is there anything else of interest here? I wish there was just a section called Goodies or Baddies, and you would know. I know that politics are complicated and not everything. Anyway, okay, so those are the Whigs. Let's just take a look at the Tories really quickly. You guys are very patient with me, and I appreciate it. The Tories were a political faction and then a political party in the parliaments of England, Scotland, Great Britain, Ireland, and the United Kingdom. Between 1670s and 1830s, somebody copied from the Whig page, by the way, or vice versa. The Tories contested power with their rivals, the Whigs. Fine. In 1678, the first Tories emerged in England as Jacobites when they opposed the Whig-supported Exclusion Bill, which set out to disinherit the heir presumptive James, Duke of York, who eventually became James II of England and 7th of Scotland. This party ceased to exist as an organized political entity in the early 1760s, although it was used as a term of self-description by some political writers, in some cases as an insult. A few decades later, a new Tory party would rise to establish a hold on government between 1783 and 1830 with William Pitt the Younger, followed by people I don't care about. So the Tories do support Roman Catholicism. While Anglican, there was a factional support for Roman Catholicism. That is interesting. When the Whigs subsequently regained control, the Representative of the People Act of 1832, that's sort of the 1832 Reform Act, removed the rotten boroughs, many of which were controlled by the Tories. In 1832, the Tory ranks were reduced to 175 members of Parliament. Interesting. Okay. So, a fun game to play with yourself right now. Don't tell me what you chose, but are you a Whig or a Tory? I think I'm a Whig. Am I a Tory? I'm not a Tory. I think I'm a Whig. Fine. Let's go back to Middlemarch. We are out of our depth politically. I am not a political analyst. What am I? I'm a bad book reader. Here we go. That is what I expect, said Mr. Brooke, not wishing to betray how little he enjoyed this prophetic sketch. What I expect as an independent man. As to the Whigs, a man who goes with the thinkers is not likely to be hooked on by any party. He may go with them up to a certain point, but that is what you ladies never understand. Where your certain point is? No. I should like to be told how a man can have any certain point when he belongs to no party, leading a roving life and never letting his friends know his address. Nobody knows where Brooke will be. There's no counting on Brooke. That is what people say of you, to be quite frank. Now do turn respectable. How will you like going to sessions with everybody looking shy on you, and you with a bad conscience and an empty pocket? I don't pretend to argue with a lady on politics, said Mr. Brooke, with an air of smiling indifference, but feeling rather unpleasantly conscious that this attack of Mrs. Cadwallader's had opened the defensive campaign to which certain rash steps had exposed him. Your sex are not thinkers, Varium et mutable semper, that kind of thing. It means a changing and inconstant thing is woman, which is from the Aeneid by our good friend Virgil. You don't know Virgil. I knew. Mr. Brooke reflected in time that he had not had the personal acquaintance of the Augustan poet. I was going to say, poor Stoddard, That was what he said. You ladies are always against an independent attitude, a man's caring for nothing but truth and that sort of thing. And there is no part of the country where opinion is narrower than it is here. I don't mean to throw stones, but somebody is wanted to take the independent line, and if I don't take it, who will? Who? Why, any upstart who has got neither blood nor position, people of standing, should consume their independent nonsense at home, not hawk it about. And you, who are going to marry your niece, as good as your daughter, to one of our best men, Sir James would be cruelly annoyed. It'll be too hard on him if you turn around now and make yourself a Whig signboard. Uh-oh, Mrs. Cadwallader is about to get some bad news. Mr. Brooke winced. Prospective taunts, yeah. It might have been easy for ignorant observers to say, quarrel with Mrs. Cadwallader, but where is a country gentleman to go who quarrels with his oldest neighbors? Who could taste the fine flavor in the name of Brooke if it were delivered casually like a wine without a seal? Certainly a man can only be cosmopolitan up to a certain point. Oh, that's curious. I'm going to continue recording, but why is it saying my microphone isn't working? I'm just going to continue. That's it. You're just watching an old man get information on his screen that you can't see that says something about how maybe this isn't recording. What a fun thing to find out later. Let's keep going. Mr. Brooke again winced inwardly, for Dorothea's engagement had no sooner been decided than he had thought of Mrs. Cadwallader's prospective taunts. It might have been easy for ignorant observers to say, quarrel with Mrs. Cadwallader. But where's a country gentleman to go who quarrels with his oldest neighbors? Who could taste the fine flavor in the name of Brooke if it were delivered casually like a wine without a seal? Certainly a man can only be cosmopolitan up to a point. I hope Chettam and I shall always be good friends, but I am sorry to say there is no prospect of his marrying my niece, said Mr. Brooke, much relieved to see through the window that Celia was coming in. Why not? Said Mrs. Cadwallader with a sharp note of surprise. It's hardly a fortnight since you and I were talking about it. My niece has chosen another suitor. Has chosen him, you know. I have had nothing to do with it. I should have preferred Chettam, and I should have Chettam. I have had nothing to do with it. I should have preferred Chettam, and I should have said Chettam was the man any girl would have chosen. But there is no accounting for these things. Your sex is capricious, you know. Why, whom do you mean to say that you are going to let her marry? Mrs. Cadwallader's mind was rapidly surveying the possibilities of choice for Dorothea. But here Celia entered, blooming from a walk in the garden, and the greeting with her... Let's try that again. No editing. But here Celia entered, blooming from a walk in the garden, and the greeting with her delivered Mr. Brooke from the necessity of answering immediately. He got up hastily and said, "By the way, I must speak to Wright about the horses," shuffled quickly out of the room. "My dear child, what is this about your sister's engagement?" said Mrs. Cadwallader. "She is engaged to marry Mr. Casaubon," said Celia, resorting as usual to the simplest statement of fact, and enjoying this opportunity of speaking to the rector's wife alone. "This is frightful. How long has it been going on?" "I only knew of it yesterday. They are to be married in 6 weeks. Well, my dear, I wish you joy of your brother-in-law. I am so sorry for Dorothea." "Sorry? It is her doing." "Yes, she says Mr. Casaubon has a great soul, with all my heart. Oh, Mrs. Cadwallader, I don't think it can be nice to marry a man with a great soul. Well, my dear, take warning. You know the look of one now. When the next comes and wants to marry you, don't accept him." "I'm sure I never should." No, one such in a family is enough. So your sister never cared about Sir James Chettam. What would you have said to him for a brother-in-law?" "I should have liked that very much. I am sure he should have been a good husband. Only," Celia added with a slight blush, she sometimes seemed to blush as she breathed, "I don't think he would have suited Dorothea." "Not high-flown enough?" "Dodo is very strict. She thinks so much about everything and is so particular about what one says. Sir James never seemed to please her." "Well, she must have encouraged him, I am sure. That is not very creditable." "Please don't be angry with Dodo. She does not see things. She thought so much about the cottages, and she was rude to Sir James sometimes. But he is so kind, he never noticed it." "Well," said Mrs. Cadwallader, putting on her shawl and rising as if in haste, "I must go straight to Sir James and break this to him. He will have brought his mother back by this time, and I must call. Your uncle will never tell him. We are all disappointed, my dear. Young people should think of their families in marrying. I set a bad example, married a poor clergyman, and made myself a pitiable object among the De Bracies, obliged to get my coals by stratagem and pray to heaven for my salad oil. However, Casaubon has money enough. I must do him that justice. As to his blood, I suppose the family quarterings are 3 cuttlefish sable and a commentator rampant. By the way, before I go, my dear, I must speak to your Mrs. Carter about pastry. I want to send my young cook to learn of her. Poor people with 4 children like us, can't afford to keep a good cook. I have no doubt Mrs. Carter will oblige me. Sir James's cook is a perfect dragon." In less than an hour, Mrs. Cadwallader had circumvented Mrs. Carter and driven to Freshitt Hall, and was not far from her own parsonage, her husband being resident in Freshitt and keeping a curate in Tipton. Sir James Chettam had returned from the short journey which had kept him absent for a couple of days, and had changed his dress, intending to ride over to Tipton Grange. His horse was standing at the door when Mrs. Cadwallader drove up, and he immediately appeared there himself, whip in hand. Lady Chettam had not yet returned, but Mrs. Cadwallader's errand could not be dispatched in the presence of grooms, so she asked to be taken into the conservatory close by to look at the new plants, and on coming to a contemplative stand, she said, "I have a great shock for you. I hope you are not so far gone in love as you pretend to be." There was of no use protesting against Mrs. Cadwallader's way of putting things. But Sir James's countenance changed a little. He felt a vague alarm. I do believe Brooke is going to expose himself after all. I accused him of meaning to stand for Middlemarch on the liberal side, and he looked silly. Never denied it. Never denied it. Talked about the independent line and the usual nonsense. Is that all? Said Sir James, much relieved. Why, rejoined Mrs. Cadwallader with a sharper note, you don't mean to say that you would like him to turn public man in that way, making a sort of political cheap jack of himself. He might be dissuaded, I should think. He would not like the expense. That is what I told him. He is vulnerable to reason there, always a few grains of common sense and an ounce of miserliness. Miserliness is a capital quality to run in families. It's the safe side for madness to dip on. And there must be a little crack in the Brooke family, else we should not see what we are to see. I love that line, by the way. Miserliness is a capital quality to run in families. It's the safe side for madness to dip on. What? Brooke standing for Middlemarch? Worse than that. I really feel a little responsible. I always told you Miss Brooke would be such a fine match. I knew there was a great deal of nonsense in her, a flighty sort of methodistical stuff, but these things were out of girls. However, I am taken by surprise for once. What do you mean, Mrs. Cadwallader? Said Sir James. His fear lest Miss Brooke should have run away to join the Moravian Brethren, or some other preposterous sect unknown to good society, was a little allayed by the knowledge that Mrs. Cadwallader always made the worst of things. What has happened to Miss Brooke? Pray speak out. Very well. She is engaged to be married. Mrs. Cadwallader paused a few moments, observing the deeply hurt expression in her friend's face, which he was trying to conceal by a nervous smile while he whipped his boot. But she soon added, engaged to Casaubon. Even so, you know my errand now. Oh, sorry. Engaged to Casaubon. Sir James let his whip fall and stooped to pick it up. Perhaps his face had never before gathered so much concentrated disgust as when he turned to Mrs. Cadwallader and repeated, Casaubon. Even so, you know my errand now. Good God, it is horrible. He is no better than a mummy. Remember, he is 45. I am 48. Ah! The point of view has to be allowed for as that of a blooming and disappointed rival. She says he is a great soul, a great bladder for dried peas to rattle in, said Mrs. Cadwallader. What business has an old bachelor like that to marry, said Sir James. He has one foot in the grave. He means to draw it out again, I suppose. Brooke ought not to allow it. He should insist on its being off till she is of age. She would think better of it then. What is a guardian for? As if you could ever squeeze a resolution out of Brooke. Cadwallader might talk to him. Oh, not he. Humphrey finds everybody charming. I never can get him to abuse Casaubon. He will even speak well of the bishop, though I tell him it is unnatural in a beneficed clergyman. What can one do with a husband who attends so little to the decencies? I hide it as well as I can by abusing everybody myself. Come, cheer up. You are well rid of Miss Brooke, a girl who would have been requiring you to see the stars by daylight. Between ourselves, little Celia is worth two of her, and likely, after all, to be the better match, for this marriage to Casaubon is as good as going to a nunnery. So what they're talking about there is that they don't think there's going to be any boot knocking between Dorothea and Casaubon to provide a male heir, and we talked about this a few episodes ago. So it works this way: if Dorothea, so the uncle has left his property to his to the next male heir, And there are no male heirs directly. There are these two daughters, Celia and Dorothea. If Dorothea marries, which she has said she's going to do, and if they had a child and it was a son, then Mr. Brooks's property, Middlemarch, would pass. I don't know if he owns all of Middlemarch, just maybe his area of Middlemarch, would pass on to that male heir. What's being alluded to here is that if Mrs. Cadwallader being, she's running on, my friend Steve likes to say that the dumbest woman in a Jane Austen novel is 100% smarter than the smartest man in a Jane Austen novel. I think that's Mrs. Cadwallader. She's just playing chess on about 25 different boards all at the same time. So she's suggesting Celia is the better match because it is unlikely that Dorothy is going to produce a male heir, and Celia might have that chance, which means the property would go to Celia and the money. Okay, let's see. Oh, on my account, it is for Miss Brooks's sake I think her friend should try to use their influence. Well, Humphrey does not know. But when I tell him, you may depend on it, he will say, why not? Casaubon is a good fellow, young enough. These charitable people never know vinegar from wine till they have swallowed it and got the colic. However, if I were a man, I should prefer Celia, especially when Dorothea was gone. The truth is you have been courting one and have won the other. I can see that she admires you almost as much as a man expects to be admired. If it were anyone but me who said so, you might think it exaggeration. Goodbye. Sir James handed Mrs. Cadwallader to the phaeton, and then jumped on his horse. He was not going to renounce his ride because of his friend's unpleasant news, only to ride the faster in some other direction than that of Tipton Grange. Now, why on earth should Mrs. Cadwallader have been at all busy about Miss Brooks's marriage, and why, when one match that she liked to think she had a hand in was frustrated, should she have straightway contrived the preliminaries of another? Was there any ingenious plot, any hide-and-seek course of action which might be detected by a careful telescopic watch? No, not at all. A telescope might have swept the parishes of Tipton and Freshitt, the whole area visited by Mrs. Cadwallader and her phaeton, without witnessing any interview that could excite suspicion, or any scene from which he did not return with the same unperturbed keenness of eye and the same high natural color. In fact, if that convenient vehicle had existed in the days of the seven sages, these are the seven sages of ancient Greece, one of them would doubtless have remarked that you can know little of women by following them about in their pony phaetons. Let's try that sentence again. In fact, if that convenient vehicle had existed in the days of the seven sages, one of them would doubtless have remarked that you can know little of women by following them about in their pony phaetons. Even with a microscope directed on a water drop, we find ourselves making interpretations which turn out to be rather coarse. For whereas under a weak lens, you may seem to see a creature exhibiting an act of veracity into which other smaller creatures actively play, as if they were so many animated tax pennies, a stronger lens reveals to you certain tiniest hairlets which make vortices for these victims, while the swallower waits patiently at his receipt of custom. In this way, metaphorically speaking, a strong lens applied to Mrs. Cadwallader's matchmaking will show a play of minute causes, producing what may be called thought and speech vortices to bring her the sort of food she needed. Oh, that's an interesting way to describe her, as a microscopic being with little hairs that create vortices. Vortices, like that boy. Her life was rurally simple, quite free from Her life was rurally simple, quite free from secrets either foul, dangerous, or otherwise important, and not consciously affected by the great affairs of the world. All the more did the affairs of the great world interest her when communicated in the letters of high-born relations, the way in which fascinating younger sons had gone to the dogs by marrying their mistresses, the fine old-blooded idiocy of young Lord Taper and the furiously gouty humors of old Lord Megatherium, the exact crossing of genealogies which had brought a coronet into a new branch and widened the relations of scandal. These were topics of which she retained details with the utmost accuracy, and reproduced them in an excellent pickle of epigrams, which she herself enjoyed the more because she believed as unquestioningly in birth and no birth as she did in game and vermin. She would never have disavowed anyone on the ground of poverty. A De Bracy reduced to take his dinner in a basin would have seemed to her an example of pathos worth exaggerating, and I fear his aristocratic vices would not have horrified her. But her feelings toward the vulgar rich was a sort of religious hatred. They had probably made all their money out of high retail prices, and Mrs. Cadwallader detested high prices for everything that was not paid in kind at the rectory. Such people were no part of God's design in making the world, and their accent was an affliction to the ears. Zach and I once went to, what's the Anheuser-Busch one? Busch Gardens. It's right there in the name, Mike. When we were younger, much younger than we are now. Well, I'm not a roller coaster person anymore. I'm not anything that's going to potentially decapitate me or leave me stuck upside down for several hours, because neither one's going to end well. But we went, and I just remember being surrounded by so many regional accents, and it was a challenge. Just lots of, I'm being classist. I'm being like Mrs. Cadwallader. Forget I said that. We'll delete that in post. No one will ever know I said it. He said, also averring to no editing, a town where such monsters abounded was hardly more than a sort of low comedy which could not be taken account of in a well-bred scheme of the universe. Let any lady who is inclined to be hard on Mrs. Cadwallader inquire into the comprehensiveness of her own beautiful views, and be quite sure that they afford accommodation for all the lives which have the honor to coexist with hers. Yeah, she allows her characters to be fully human, but then she also chastises her characters in the she in this sentence is George Eliot. Sorry, I should have said that to begin with. Was such a mind active as phosphorus, biting everything that came near into the form that suited it? How could Mrs. Cadwallader feel that the Miss Brookes had and their matrimonial prospects were alien to her, especially as it had been the habit of years for her to scold Mr. Brooke with the friendliest frankness, and let him know in confidence that she thought him a poor creature? From the first arrival of the young ladies in Tipton, she had prearranged Dorothea's marriage with Sir James, and if it had taken place, would have been quite sure that it was her doing. That it should not take place after she had preconceived it caused her an irritation which every freethinker will sympathize with. She was the diplomatist of Tipton and Freshenden, for anything to happen in spite of her was an offensive irregularity. As to freaks like this of Miss Brookes's, Mrs. Cadwallader had no patience with them, and now saw that her opinion of this girl had been infected with some of her husband's weak charitableness. Those methodistical whims, that air of being more religious than the rector and curate together, came from a deeper and more constitutional disease than she had been willing to believe. However, said Mrs. Cadwallader, first to herself and afterwards to her husband, I throw her over. There was a chance, if she had married Sir James, of her becoming a sane, sensible woman. He would never have contradicted her, and when a woman is not contradicted, she has no motive for obstinacy and absurdities. But now I wish her joy of her hair shirt. It followed that Mrs. Cadwallader must decide on another match for Sir James, and having made up her mind that it was to be the younger Miss Brooke, There could not have been a more skillful move toward the success of her plan than her hint to the baronet that he had made an impression on Celia's heart. For he was not one of those gentlemen who languish after the unattainable Sappho's apple that laughs from the topmost bough, the charms which, quote, smile like the knot of cowslips on the cliff, not to become by at the willing hand. That's a curious, So, lesbians. Why don't we talk about them a little bit? There is there's an urban legend or an apocryphal story, or however you want to label it, that Queen Victoria did not believe in lesbians because she couldn't understand what they were. That's not true. That lady knew a lot about sex, and she had a lot of sex, and she enjoyed sex with Albert. And I think they also had some pornographic art that does not often get mentioned in biographies. A lot of rich people had pornographic art because as long as there was a cherub or as long as the naked person was a biblical or historical figure, it was fine. So this bit here, let's read that again. For he was not, and this he is Sir James Chettam, for he was not one of those gentlemen who languish after the unattainable Sappho's apple that laughs from the topmost bough, the charms which smile like the knot of cowslips on the cliff, not to be come at by the willing hand. So it's interesting that she sort of chooses to use Sappho as a symbol here, and what we know of the island of Lesbos. It's all a problem. Lesbians aren't a problem. I love them. It's just understanding the way our minds have changed over the years about what sexuality is, what gender is, if there is gender. Like gender could have just been something we made up pretty early on because it was easy to tell people with that thing between their legs over here, people with that thing between their legs over there, and now we're done. And then it got complicated and more complicated and more complicated because we started on a faulty premise. He had no sonnets to write, and it could not strike him agreeably that he was not an object of preference to the woman whom he had preferred. Although the knowledge that Dorothea had chosen Mr. Casaubon had bruised his attachment and relaxed its hold. Already the knowledge that Dorothea had chosen Mr. Casaubon had bruised his attachment and relaxed its hold. Although Sir James was a sportsman, he had some other feelings toward women than towards grouses and foxes, and did not regard his future wife in the light of prey, valuable chiefly for the excitements of the chase. Neither was he so well acquainted with the habits of primitive races as to feel that an ideal combat for her, tomahawk in hand, so to speak, was necessary to the historical continuity of the marriage tie. I can't explain, there's no excuse for that sentence. It's just racism, but they didn't know it. But I mean, poison is poison regardless of when you find it. And if you thought it wasn't, it turns out it was, it turns out it always was, and you were wrong to begin with. On the contrary, having the amiable vanity which knits us to those who are fond of us and disinclines us to those who are indifferent, and also a good, grateful nature, the mere idea that a woman had a kindness towards him spun little threads of tenderness from out his heart towards hers. So books talking to books again. There is in Anna Karenina by Tolstoy, there is a man named Levin who has been in love with each of the sisters in this family, and then it just sort of didn't work out with this one, didn't work out with this one, didn't work out with this one. He's got Kitty at last, and it doesn't work out with Kitty. And you get the sense that he doesn't necessarily love Kitty. Maybe he grows to love her by the end of the novel. My friend Steve will argue that, and he gets weepy at the scene where they play the wooden block game and spell out "I love you" to each other. But I think he just wanted to marry into that family. He just wanted a sister, one of those sisters. Any one of them would do. And in a sense, James Chettam has got that, or at least that's what Eliot has just described James Chettam as someone who could quickly go from Dorothea to Celia, that all it took was knowing that there might be some interest, which, by the way, Celia has not necessarily represented in our earshot. Mrs. Cadwallader, better be careful. Let's have a sip of tea. Thus it happened that, after Sir James had ridden rather fast for half an hour in a direction away from Tipton Grange, he slackened his pace and at last turned into a road which would lead him back by a shorter cut. Various feelings wrought in him the determination, after all, to go to the Grange today as if nothing new had happened. He could not help rejoicing that he had never made the offer and had been rejected. Mere friendly politeness required that he should call to see Dorothy about the cottages, and now, happily, Mrs. Cadwallader had prepared him to offer his congratulations, if necessary, without showing too much awkwardness. He really did not like it. Giving up Dorothea was very painful to him, but there was something in the resolve to make this visit forthwith and conquer all shows of fear, all show of feeling, which was a sort of file-biting and counter-irritant. And without his distinctly recognizing the impulse, there certainly was present in him the sense that Celia would be there, and that he should pay her more attention than he had done before. We mortals, men and women, devour many a disappointment between breakfast and dinner time, keep back the tears and look a little pale about the lips, and in answer to inquiry say, "Oh, nothing." Pride helps us, and pride is not a bad thing when it only urges us to hide our own hurts, not to hurt others. Let's read that one more time. That's a great ending paragraph. We mortals, men and women, devour many a disappointment between breakfast and dinner time, keep back the tears and look a little pale about the lips, and in answer to inquiry say, "Oh, nothing." Pride helps us, and pride is not a bad thing when it only urges us to hide our own hurts, not to hurt others. Now, there's a lot to disagree with there. It's complicated. So on the one hand, I think what she's saying is when pride is the catalyst for how do I want to say that? Because what she's saying necessarily is if you hide your feelings, that's good. And if you use your pride to hurt others, that's bad. We can agree on the second part of that clause. It's the first part that I don't know that it is healthy to hide your feelings, but maybe your feelings don't need to be heard by the person you think needs to hear them. Like Dorothea doesn't need to hear that James Chettam is hurt, that she won't marry him. That's not her job. But I think he should talk to someone. They don't have therapists, and I don't think they take his insurance. But I think I get where she's going with it. And it's a sentiment that makes sense in the 19th century because they aren't where we are now. But I don't think it's a sentence that makes sense in the 20th century or the 21st century. I forget what century we're in. How old are we? Were we ever young? Have we always been 48? Yeah, we've always been 48. All right, that was chapter 6. I don't think we did too many discursions this time, did we? I think we pretty much read through stumblingly, which is my want. I hope to see you tomorrow for chapter 7. we are just breezing through this book. There's only like 900 more chapters to go. We're so close to the end. You can see it. Anyway, this has been Mike Bevel. This has been Footnotes. That was me looking to see where to put the mouse so I can stop this. I am doing this only for me. And I look forward to coming back in a year and listening to where my mind was while reading this book. Maybe this one will be a little bit longer because I do want to end with this. I think books require rereading. Good books require rereading. There's some books you just read once and think, yeah, I got it. Jaws, thank you. But some books, like a Middlemarch or the Makioka Sisters or Invisible Man, require us to read them at least twice. Like the first time you're reading through, and you're really reading through because you want to get the big picture. You want to let's ride the ride. And then the second time through is when you can stop and notice things. Oh, look what happened. And I've done that a little bit here. Like every once in a while, a line will remind me, oh, she echoes that earlier in the novel, often in the prelude. Like the prelude comes up a lot throughout the book. So it's a very smart piece of writing at the beginning of Middlemarch. So the second time through, you notice more. The third time through is when it really gets interesting, because you can start to notice sort of even bigger structures a little bit in the distance, as if you were approaching a vast city on horseback. So that's what reading should be. A book worth reading once is a book worth reading twice. Nope, that doesn't make sense with what I said before. A good book worth reading once is a book worth reading twice, just to make sure you caught all the things that were catchable. Like syphilis. I'm kidding, don't catch syphilis, it's terrible. Zach and I went to the Motor Museum for the first time many years ago, and there was a syphilis exhibit from Lewis and Clark, and those guys just fucked anything that didn't have quills. And that's how America was made, by sex-ravaged white guys tramping through the forest, being mean to Indians, and claiming all the land for a country that didn't own it. This has been Politics with Mike Bell, and I'm going to say goodbye, and that I love you very much, and I will see you tomorrow.